That animal is gone by Friday, or the man who keeps feeding it goes with it. The new inspector of the forecourt said it the way a man reads a fine off a slate, without looking up, while a small brown dog with one folded ear sat at the end of our line and thumped her tail against the cobbles as if she'd just been promised something good. I was 3 men down from Prout that morning, close enough to see the muscle move in his jaw and nowhere else. We are not allowed to answer. I want that understood from the start before I tell you what Prout did, because the whole weight of this hangs on it. A man at the post does not speak, does not turn his head, does not so much as let his eyes drop to a stray dog leaning warm against his boot. He stands. That is the entire art of him. And that is why, when the order came down to drive Tess off the establishment, none of us thought there was a thing on earth we could do about it. Let me give you her first, because the inspector never bothered to, and because you cannot understand the rest of it until you know what he was ordering thrown out. She came to the Aldgate barracks in the autumn the way most strays come, which is to say sideways and starving and prepared to be kicked. None of us knew where from. There is a goods lane behind the cookhouse where the kitchen bins stand, and one cold morning cook found her curled in the gap behind them, ribs like a ladder, one ear permanently folded down where something had once gone wrong with it. He gave her a heel of bacon expecting her to bolt with it. She didn't. She took it gently as a duchess taking a glove, ate it, and then sat and looked at him with the patience of a creature who had decided, against all her evidence, to trust one more person. Cook is a hard old article who has fed 3,000 soldiers and likes none of them. He came back the next morning with more bacon and a name. Tess. He swears he doesn't know why, she just looked like a Tess. By midwinter she belonged to the whole regiment and to no one in particular, which is the only proper way for a barracks dog to belong. She learned us. That is the thing about her that I have never been able to explain to anyone who wasn't there. She learned the rhythm of the place the way a soldier learns it, by feel. She knew the dressing bell from the dinner bell. She knew the difference between a man going on duty, who must not be bothered, and a man coming off it, who could be leaned against and made much of. She would walk a relief down to the gate and walk it back, 3 paces off the flank, never once breaking the column or fouling a boot, as if some forgotten drill sergeant had taught her where a dog stands. When the band practiced, she lay in the doorway of the music store with her folded ear toward the noise and her good ear toward the yard, on watch even in her sleep. And she found Prout, or Prout found her. I have never been sure which, and neither were they. Daniel Prout was the quietest man in our company, and that is a high bar in a regiment that prizes silence the way other men prize gold. He'd come up from a hard place. We all knew that much and no more because he didn't trade in it. No family that anyone had met. No leave that he took. He was the man who volunteered for the Christmas duties so a married man could go home, and the man who'd lend you his own boot brush and never ask for it back, and the man you could stand beside for 2 hours in the cold and never once feel you had to fill the silence, because his silence was a comfortable room and not an empty one. He was 3 years older than me, and I'd have followed him into anything. Tess chose him. By spring she slept across his door. He'd come off a night relief gray with cold, and there she'd be, and he'd crouch down in the dark of the corridor and put his forehead against the top of her head for a moment, and whatever he carried that he never set down for the rest of us, he set it down for her. I saw it once and pretended I hadn't. A man is allowed one place to put the thing down. Hers was the only one Prout had. That was what the inspector ordered destroyed, though he'd never have said destroyed. He was far too careful a man for a word with blood in it. His name was Mr. Halgrove, and he had been at the barracks 11 days. He had come to us from somewhere in the great machinery of the Office of Works, the part of the kingdom's household that counts drain pipes and approves the color of paint, and he had arrived with the particular hunger of a small man, given his first real ground to stand on. He wore a gray coat that fit him too well and carried a black notebook he was forever writing in, and he had decided, I think before he ever set foot on our cobbles, that the place was slack, and that he was the broom sent to sweep it. He found a great deal to write down: the color of the cookhouse step, the angle of a downpipe, a bicycle leaned where a bicycle had been leaned for 40 years. And on his third morning he found Tess asleep in a square of sun by the guardroom door, and he stopped, and I watched the whole thing close behind his eyes like a ledger. "Whose is that?" Nobody answered, because that is the honest answer. She is ours, she is no one's. "It's unhygienic," he said to the air, and wrote in his book. "It's improper. A working military establishment is not a place for vagrant animals. There are regulations." And he walked on, and we thought, the way you do, that it was just one more thing for the black notebook, like the downpipe, a thing a fussy man says and forgets. He did not forget. That was our first mistake, thinking a man like Halgrove forgets. Men like Halgrove file. A week later the order came down on paper, which is how you knew it was meant. It was typed, and it bore the stamp of the Office of Works, and it directed that the stray animal presently resident on the establishment be removed by the end of the week, as constituting a breach of regulation and a hazard to good order, and that any member of the regiment found harboring, feeding, or sheltering the said animal thereafter would be subject to charge. He had us cold. That is the part I want you to feel. It was not a cruel man shouting. It was a clean piece of paper with a stamp on it, and it had thought of everything, and it had even thought of Prout, the man who fed her, the man who'd be the one to go down for her if any of us did. The sergeant read it out at evening parade in a voice with nothing in it, because a sergeant's job is to read out the order and not his opinion of it. I watched Prout's face the whole time. Nothing moved. Of course nothing moved. We are trained until nothing moves. But I was close, and I have stood beside that man in every weather there is, and I saw the thing go through him like cold water through a pipe. When the sergeant said the word charge, Prout's eyes found me for half a second no longer, and then went forward again. We talked about it that night the way men talk when they've been forbidden a thing they love and given a paper reason for it. Quietly, bitterly, useless. Someone said we could hide her, walk her out to a farm. Someone said that only buys a week and gets a man charged besides. And what kind of life is it for a dog who learned the dinner bell, shut in a barn 3 valleys off? Someone said the obvious cruel arithmetic of it, that you cannot fight the Office of Works with a barracks room and a brown dog, that the thing was decided in an office by a man with a stamp, and that men with stamps do not lose to soldiers. The fire went out of it fast, the way it does when men are right and hate it. Prout said nothing the whole time. He sat on the end of his cot with his elbows on his knees and his hands hanging, and Tess lay across his feet with her chin on his boot and her one good ear up, listening to a conversation about her she could not follow, trusting the men in it the way she'd trusted Cook with that first heel of bacon. And at the end of it, when the rest of us had argued ourselves down into silence, Prout said one thing, low, almost to himself. "He can put me on a charge. He can't make me turn her out." And I want to tell you I knew in that moment that it would all come right. I didn't. I thought he was a good man saying a brave, doomed thing in the dark, the way good men do, and that Friday would come and the paper would win the way paper always wins. I went to sleep half sick about it. I did not yet understand that I was watching the first move in something, and that the thing I'd taken for a doomed man's stubbornness was the only correct thing any of us had said all night. Because here is what Prout understood that the rest of us in our anger had missed. The order told him not to harbor her, not to feed her, not to shelter her. It said remove. It did not, anywhere in its clean typed lines, give him a thing to do that he could be ordered to do at the post. And Prout was a man who had spent his whole disciplined life learning the exact and narrow space between what you are ordered to do and what no order can reach. That space is the whole of a guardsman's honor. He had lived in it for years. He simply moved Tess into it with him. Friday morning, Halgrove came to see his order carried out. He came at the changing of the guard, which I have always thought was deliberate, because that is when there are eyes, the public at the rail, the off-duty men, the relief forming up. He came with 2 men from the Office of Works and a third man I didn't know, A thin official with a leather bag, and I did not like the look of that bag, and I think I knew before anyone said a word what was in it. A leash, a muzzle, the quiet apparatus of removal. Halgrove had brought a man to take the dog away, and he had timed it for the busiest hour on the cobbles, because a man like Halgrove wants the thing done in front of an audience, so that everyone learns the lesson at once. Prout was on the gate. That too I have always believed Halgrove arranged, though I have no proof of it. He wanted the man who loved her to be the one standing there, in full dress, forbidden to move, while they took her. He wanted to break something and break it publicly and call it good order. Tess was sitting at Prout's heel in the sun by the gate, exactly where she sat every morning of her life, and Halgrove walked up to within a yard of a King's Guardsman at his post, which civilians do, not knowing better, but he knew better. He'd read the regulations on it, and he pointed his pen at the dog and said, loud enough for the rail, "Move it along. Now, this is your last chance to do it yourself before I have it done for you." And Prout did not move. I have to make you understand what that refusal cost and what it was, because a man who has not stood the post will think it the easiest thing in the world to do nothing. It is the hardest. Every nerve in Prout's body was telling him to step between that thin man with the leather bag and the dog asleep against his boot. The whole animal in him, the part that had crouched in the dark corridor with his forehead on her head, was screaming to act, and the discipline of a lifetime was holding it still. He did not step in front of her. He did not strike the pen out of Halgrove's hand. He did not so much as look down. He stood at his post, eyes forward, rifle at the carry, the way he'd stand if the sky fell, and he let the silence do the only thing he was permitted to do with it. He made Halgrove be the man who reached past a guardsman, at a guardsman's post, in front of the public, to drag a dog out from under him. Because that is what it would look like. And Prout knew, with the cold, clear knowledge of a man who has spent his life being looked at, exactly what it would look like. The thin man with the bag hesitated. You could see it. He'd been hired to collect a stray, a simple thing, and now the simple thing meant crossing the chalk line of a sentry's post and stooping under his rifle to seize the animal at his feet, while 50 people at the rail filmed it on their telephones, and the whole changing of the guard stood frozen around him. He looked at Halgrove, and Halgrove, who had never in his life had to do the actual reaching himself, said, "Well, get on with it," in a voice that had gone up half a tone. And that is the moment Tess, who could not read an order or a regulation or a black notebook, did the one thing that turned it. She stood up, slowly, stiffly, the way she'd taken to standing of late. She put herself of her own accord square between Prout's boots, facing the thin man with the bag, and she did not growl. She never once growled, that's the thing of her. She simply leaned back against the guardsman's legs and looked at the man who'd come for her with those steady, patient eyes, the eyes that had decided to trust people against all her evidence, and she waited to see whether that trust had been a mistake. You could hear the rail go quiet, then you could hear it not be quiet at all. A woman near the front said, clear and carrying, "What are they doing? They're not taking that dog." A man beside her had his telephone up and was talking into it, narrating it, the way they do now. Somewhere a child began to cry, not from fear, I think, but because children read a wrong faster than we do, and she'd read this one, and her mother's voice saying it's all right, in a tone that meant it plainly wasn't. 50 people who had come to watch the pretty soldiers change had instead been handed, with no warning, a clean little drama of a fussy man in a gray coat, trying to take a brown dog away from a soldier who wasn't allowed to stop him. And there is not a crowd on this earth that watches that and roots for the man with the notebook. Halgrove felt it turn. I watched it happen on his face, the dawning late that he had badly misjudged his theater. He'd wanted to teach a lesson in front of an audience, and he had forgotten that an audience chooses its own side. He rounded on the rail. "This is a matter of regulation," he said to them, too loud. "This is not a sentimental matter. There are rules." "Then you've got rotten rules," the woman said, and the rail laughed, and that laugh was the worst sound Halgrove had heard all week, because you cannot find a laugh, You cannot stamp it, you cannot file it, and it was at him. The thin man with the bag put the bag down. He just set it on the cobbles, straightened up, and said, not unkindly, I'm not pulling a dog out from under a sentry in front of all this. You want it done, you find another man. And he walked back toward the gate, out of it done. That should have been the end of it, you'd think. It wasn't, and it's important that it wasn't, because a crowd's mood is a weather and weather passes, and Halgrove still had his typed order and his stamp, and tomorrow there'd be no rail and no telephones, just a quiet morning and a man who files. The crowd had bought Tess a day. It had not saved her. What saved her was what the day set in motion, and that started the moment the duty officer came out to see why the changing of the guard had stopped dead in its tracks. His name was Lieutenant Caro, and he was young, and I had not before that morning formed any particular opinion of him. He came out at a fast walk, taking in the frozen relief and the crowd and the gray-coated man shouting at the rail and the brown dog standing between Prute's boots, and he did the thing that told me everything I ever needed to know about him afterward. He did not ask Prute anything. He did not put Prute in the position of having to break his silence at the post. He stepped in front of Halgrove instead and put his own body between the official and the dog and said quietly, so it didn't carry, "You'll address the regiment through me, sir, not through my sentry. He can't answer you and you know it. That's a poor thing to do to a man who can't answer." Halgrove drew himself up. "I have an order from the Office of Works." "Then you'll bring it to the orderly room and not enforce it at the gate in front of 200 people, Caro said. "Take your men inside. This stops now." And there was enough in his voice, not loud, never loud, but with the whole regiment standing behind it, that Halgrove, after a moment in which you could see him calculate and find the arithmetic against him, gathered his men and his thin official and his abandoned leather bag and went inside to fight it on paper, which was where he was certain he could not lose. And he was nearly right. That is the part of this I have to be honest about. For 2 days it looked as though the gate had been a flash of glory and the office would have the real say, the way the office always does. Caro had bought time, the way the crowd had bought a day, but the order still stood, stamped, typed, correct. The regiment runs on paper as much as on drill, and the paper said remove. You do not beat the Office of Works by being loved at a railing. You beat it, it turns out, the way Tess herself would have done it, patiently, by trusting the right people one more time against all the evidence. It began with Cook, of all people. Cook, who hates everyone, sat down that night with a stub of pencil and the slow, careful penmanship of a man who left school at 12, and he wrote out in his own words the whole story of the dog, the bins, the bacon, the folded ear, the name. He wrote that she had walked 1,000 reliefs to the gate and back and never once fouled a step. He wrote that she'd waited 4 hours in the cold, the night young Tompkin was carried off with his appendix, lying at the infirmary door, and would not be moved until the surgeon came out at dawn and told the men he'd live, and only then did she go and eat. I had forgotten that until Cook wrote it down. He wrote that a barracks is a hard place, and a soldier's life is a hard life, and that the men of this regiment were the better for having one creature about them that asked nothing and gave its whole heart, and that he had cooked for soldiers for 30 years and never seen a thing do more good for less cost. And he signed it. And then he passed it round, and it came back to him with 140 names on it, which was every man in the barracks who could sign and a few who only made their mark, and he folded it up and gave it to Lieutenant Caro and said, "For whoever it is that decides things." Caro did not laugh at it, which a lesser officer would have. He read it standing in the orderly room with his cap off, and when he'd finished he was quiet a while, and then he did the thing that turned the paper. He did not send Cook's letter up the chain as a plea. He sent it up as evidence, attached to a request of his own, a formal request that the matter be reviewed before the order was enforced, on the grounds that the animal in question was not, in his considered judgment, a vagrant stray but an established feature of the establishment's good order and morale, and that its removal would be detrimental to the welfare of the men. He used the office's own language back at it. He buried Tess in the very regulations Halgrove had reached for, and he sent it not to Halgrove but past him, up to the colonel, who is the one man at the barracks that even the Office of Works must answer when he chooses to be answered. The colonel sent for Halgrove, he sent for Caro. He sent in time for Prout, though I'll come to that, because what passed between the colonel and Prout is the hinge of the whole thing, and I want to give it room. But first there was the matter of the public, and the public by now had got hold of it well and truly. The man at the rail who'd narrated the whole thing into his telephone had not, it turned out, been talking to himself. He'd been sending it out live, and by that evening a great many people who had never seen our gate had watched a gray-coated official try to take a dog from a soldier who could not move to stop her, and had watched the dog stand up between his boots, and had watched a thin man set down his bag and walk away rather than do it. People are not always wise, but they are very often right, and they were right about this. The letters started the next day. Not to us, to the household, to the Office of Works itself, to the newspapers. A retired sergeant wrote that in his day a regimental dog was an honored thing, and the man who'd order one turned out had no business near soldiers. A schoolteacher wrote that she'd brought her class to see the changing of the guard for 11 years, and that what her children had learned that morning about a man keeping faith with a helpless creature was worth more than any lesson she'd ever given them. A woman wrote, and this one the colonel kept, I'm told, in his own desk, that she had been at the rail, that her own boy had cried, and that when she'd knelt to tell him the soldier wouldn't let anything bad happen, she had realized she believed it, and that a country whose soldiers a frightened child can believe in like that is a country worth the having, and would they please, for the love of all that was decent, let the dog stay. And the men did not leave it to letters. That is the thing about a regiment that an Office of Works man can never quite weigh on his scales. The off-duty men took it in turns, without anyone ordering them to walk Tess past the rail at the hours the crowds were thickest, so the public would see her well and whole and know she was still there, still kept. A corporal who had a cousin in the newspapers made sure the cousin had the whole of it, the bins and the bacon and the night at the infirmary door. Tomkin, the boy whose appendix she'd waited out, wrote his own account in a round young hand, and it was the one the newspapers liked best of all, because there is nothing the public loves like a soldier the dog once watched over speaking up for the dog. Even the band did its part. They let it be known, in the way bands do, that the regimental dog had lain in their doorway through every practice for 3 winters, and that they'd be obliged if no one took their audience away. None of it was organized. All of it pointed the same direction. A regiment is a slow animal, but it is a large one, and once it has decided a thing is right, it leans its whole weight on it without a word of command, and you would be astonished what a barracks can do quietly when it has made up its collective mind. What no one outside the gate ever knew, what I only pieced together later from Cook, who knew everything, was why it had gone so hard into Prout, harder than into any of us. Prout had been astray himself in his way. A hard place, we'd always said, and left it there. Cook said the hard place had a name, and the name was a children's home in a cold northern town, and that Daniel Prout had been a boy nobody signed for, passed along and along, learning young the exact lesson Tess had unlearned, that you do not trust the people who feed you, because they go. He had built the whole still fortress of himself on that. And then a half-starved dog had walked in off the lane and looked at him and decided, wrongly by all his evidence and rightly by hers, that he was a man who would not go. He had spent his life proving the world right about him. She had spent 4 months proving it wrong, and he could not, when it came to it, let a gray-coated stranger prove it right again. That is what he could not say in the mess hall and did not need to. It was in every still line of him at the gate. The Office of Works does not care for letters to the newspapers. That is the lever in the end that turned it, not the love at the railing which passes, but the slow, steady weight of 1,000 decent people, and a whole regiment behind them, who had decided they were on the side of the dog. A bureau can outlast a crowd. It cannot outlast its own reputation. Somewhere above Halgrove, a person with a larger desk and a longer view read the morning's letters and made a small, cold calculation of his own, and the calculation came out the opposite way to Halgrove's, and that was that. But the colonel did not let it be settled by men with larger desks. He had a regiment to run, and he meant to settle it himself, in front of the regiment, so that no man ever wondered which way the thing had gone or why. He held a hearing. That is too grand a word, but I don't have a better one in the long mess hall, with Halgrove on one side and Caro on the other, and Cook's letter on the table between them and the company filling the benches. And Tess, I am not ashamed to say, lying in a patch of sun by the cold hearth, brought in by Prout on the colonel's own order, so that the thing they were deciding about was in the room while they decided it. Halgrove made his case, and it was, on paper, a good one. He was not a stupid man. He spoke of regulation and precedent and hygiene and the thin edge of the wedge. If a dog today, what tomorrow? Where does a man draw the line? He spoke well and coldly, and he was, in the narrow way of such men, entirely correct, and I felt the case turning back toward him as he spoke, because that is the power of a man who is correct about small things and blind to large ones. He finished and sat down certain, and looked at the colonel the way a man looks who has laid out the rules and expects the rules to be served. The colonel let the silence sit. He is good at silence. He came up through the post like the rest of us. Then he turned, not to Caro, not to Halgrove, but to Prout, standing at attention by the wall, and he said, "Private Prout, you are the man who has been feeding this animal. You were ordered to stop and to turn her out, and you did not. You stood your post on Friday and let it come to what it came to rather than move her yourself. I want to hear it from you. Why did you refuse a lawful order?" And Prout, who is the quietest man in the regiment, who trades in silence the way other men trade in gold, was given leave to speak, and he spoke. I have it close to word for word because I have turned it over in my head 1,000 times since. "Sir, I never refused to do my duty. There was no order I could refuse at the post I stood it. I was ordered not to harbor her, and I have not put a roof over her, and I was ordered not to feed her, and since the order came I have not, sir, though it has been the hardest thing I have done in this uniform. I obeyed it to the letter." He stopped. The colonel waited. "What I would not do, sir, is be the man who turned her out. The order said remove. It did not say it had to be me, and it did not say I had to lift my hand against her to do it, and I will take whatever charge comes for that. But you asked me why, sir, so I'll tell you why." He looked for the only time, down at the dog asleep in the sun. "Because she trusted us, every one of us. She came in off the lane half dead, and decided to trust soldiers, sir, when she had every reason in the world not to trust anything that walked on 2 legs, and she has never once been wrong about a man in this barracks. And it seemed to me, sir, that a regiment that would teach a creature it was safe with us, and then put it out the gate because a rule said so, that's a regiment that's learned the rule and forgot the reason for it. We stand the post to keep faith with people who can't stand it for themselves. That's the whole of it, sir. That's the only thing the post means. I didn't know how to keep faith with the kingdom and break faith with her in the same morning. So I stood still, and I let it be seen, and I hoped someone with more power than me would see it the right way. That's the truth of my refusal, sir. I'd give the same answer again." The mess hall was very quiet. Tess slept on, her one good ear twitching at a fly, entirely innocent of the fact that a man had just laid his whole career on the table for her in the cleanest words I ever heard a soldier speak. The colonel looked at him a long moment. Then he looked at Cook's letter, and at the bench full of men who had signed it, and at the gray-coated official who had brought a leather bag to a guardsman's post at the busy hour, and he made his ruling, and he made it for the regiment to hear. The order is overturned. He said it flatly, the way you'd give any order, and let it land before he went on. Mr. Halgrove, your regulation concerns vagrant animals and hazards to good order. It is my judgment, and mine is the judgment that governs this establishment, that this animal is neither. She is no more a vagrant than the colors in that case are a vagrant flag. She has a post and she keeps it. I have served 40 years and I have never seen a thing keep its post more faithfully, and I am not about to be taught the meaning of good order by a man who would mistake her for a hazard to it. He paused. She will be entered on the strength of this establishment as the regimental dog by name, and rationed accordingly, and no man will be charged for feeding her, least of all the one who refused to betray her. That is on the orders in writing today. And Mr. Halgrove, the next time you find a thing on my establishment that you do not understand, you will ask a soldier what it is for before you reach for your stamp. Dismissed. I would like to tell you that Halgrove was ruined, that he was marched out, that something dramatic and final happened to him, because that is the shape these stories are supposed to take. Nothing of the kind happened. He gathered his notebook and his dignity and went back to the Office of Works, and I expect, counted drainpipes somewhere else. A smaller man in a gray coat who had reached for his stamp once too often and been quietly, completely overruled in front of 200 men. That was punishment enough for a man like Halgrove, who lived for the weight of his own small authority. He had brought it to bear with everything he had, and a brown dog and a silent soldier and a cook's penciled letter had simply outweighed it, and he had to carry the knowledge of that out the gate with him. I almost felt for him. He'd been correct about everything except the only thing that mattered. They entered her on the strength that afternoon. The clerk wrote it in the great ledger in the proper hand. Tess, regimental dog, Aldgate Barracks, and under the column for date of attestation he put the day she'd first been found behind the bins, because Cook insisted, and Cook had earned the right to insist. She was, from that hour, as much a soldier of the establishment as any of us, with a name in the book and a ration drawn against it, and a standing no man could touch, and the order that had come for her, the clean typed paper with the stamp that had thought of everything, was filed away with a single line struck through it, and the word overturned written across in the colonel's own hand. The public never quite let go of her after that. She became, in a small way, famous, the dog they tried to turn out, the dog the soldier wouldn't betray. People came to the rail asking for her by name. A woman knitted her a coat for the winter, red, with brass buttons sewn down the front in a row like a tunic, and Prout put it on her on the cold mornings, and she wore it down to the gate and back with what I can only call pride, 3 paces off the flank, never breaking the column. Children left things for her at the rail. The schoolteacher brought her class back and told them, this time, how it ended. But the part I keep, the part I'd want you to keep if you keep nothing else, is none of the public business. It's a small thing I saw the night the order was overturned, when the mess had emptied and the famous day was done. Prout took her out to the gate, off duty in the dark, just the two of them, the way it had been before any of it. And he crouched down on the cold cobbles the way I'd seen him do once before and pretended I hadn't, and he put his forehead against the top of her head, and he stayed like that a long time. I was meant to be elsewhere. I went on being elsewhere a moment longer than I should have, because I have stood beside that man in every weather there is, and I had never once heard his voice break. And it broke then, very quietly, into the fur of a dog who could not understand a word of it and understood the whole of it perfectly. "They were going to take you," he said. "They were going to take you and I couldn't move. I'm sorry. I couldn't move." And Tess, who had decided one cold morning to trust soldiers against all her evidence, and who had turned out, every single time, to be right, leaned her whole weight back against the man who had stood like a stone, and let the world see what it was doing rather than betray her, leaned back against him the way she had between his boots at the gate, and thumped her tail twice against the cobbles, forgiving him a thing he had never needed forgiving. He stood the post, That was all he ever did. He stood still in his red coat with his eyes forward and let it be seen, and trusted that somewhere a man with more power than him would see it right. And somewhere a man did. That is what the post is for. Not the order you obey, and not the order you refuse, but the faith you keep with the ones who can't keep it for themselves, and the quiet certainty, drilled into a man's bones until it holds even when everything in him is screaming to move, that if he only stands fast and lets the truth be seen, the rest of us will come. We came. We always come. That is the whole of the regiment, and a brown dog with one folded ear taught it to us better than any sergeant ever did. She lived 4 more years on the strength, and died old and warm and fed, in the music store doorway with her folded ear toward the band, and they buried her by the gate she'd walked 10,000 reliefs to, under a small stone Cook paid for, and the stone says only her name and the one word the regiment chose, the word that was true of her from the first cold morning to the last warm one, and that not a man among us has ever been ashamed to be measured against. It says Tess. And under it says, faithful at her post,